Hello, and welcome to this episode of Central Valley Stories, Advertising and Public Relations. On this podcast, we talk history, trends, changes, and challenges with some of the region's veteran practitioners and agency owners. I'm your host, Professor Betsy Hayes, in the Media, Communications, and Journalism Department at Fresno State. Enjoy! Today in the studio, we're so pleased to have Bruce Batti with us, who's going to be sharing about his fabulous career, which includes retail, agency ownership, and just about a million adventures in between.
We'll hear angst in there.
And angst, and music, and bands, and celebrity, and all the things. Yes. So we can't wait to get started. So speaking of getting started, how did things all begin with your career?
Before I do that, I just want to paint a picture for the audience. We are in the luxurious, this is the size of a football field, quite frankly, here at KFSR in the studio. So I can barely see Betsy. She's way on the other side of the room. It's a little bit off-putting, but I'm going to manage to make this happen. So the start, magnanimous. I loved music growing up. My mom loved music. It sort of permeated the house. My brother's still a musician who still gigs down in L.A. So we, like all really 13-year-old boys, thought we should be in a band because A, it's a good way to get chicks, and B, we liked music. And A never really panned out either, but the music portion was great. So I realized at an early age that was a needle that was hard to thread and make money and monetize, and only a select few got there. So I wanted to be music adjacent. So my last year out at Fresno State, and then of course worked at KFSR, and it was at the time just a carrier current station. So the only people that could hear you were the dorm and the student union. So audience of 2, maybe 3, it was very significant at the time. But I was saying stupid stuff. So really that was probably a good thing for everybody. But you could put a reel together. They did have a reel-to-reel. So that was the whole object, was do your shtick, cut your demo tape together, and then get a gig. So I was a ringer on the softball team for K-Fig, and you always do that because you want to be adjacent. And then the one time you're at a game and they go, hey, Bob is sick. Do you want to go in there and just, sure. So that turned into an overnight gig at K-Fig, and that sort of started my pathway, really. And I wanted to be on air. I was going to do that. But in that year of doing that part-time, I thought that pathway was also just being stuck at the microphone. While I could do it, just didn't float my boat, really. So as I was ending my last semester at Fresno State, I thought, well, I should probably get a job. My parents would be happy about it. I would personally feel my life was more affirmed. So I looked at knowing that, all right, I'm not going to become a disc jockey. I'm not going to be a radio personality because it really wasn't my thing. So now how can I sort of stay in that creative mode? My brother, who continues to gig in Fresno at the time, a band called March Hare, I would go see him, and there would be people who followed him. One of those people was the HR director at Gottschalk. And so in talking to her, she's like, can you do training films? And I'm like, that's a piece of cake. Who couldn't do training films? I don't know what it is, but I'm sure I could. So ended up, this is a funny story. I remember my first day there, and I was still here at Fresno State. My first day there, I took Dr. Lane with me. So it's like taking your parents to your first day on the job. So Dr. Lane comes with me, and like, look, I'm bringing my prof with me. So this is foolproof. What could go wrong now, right? So that is really concierge college right there. See? Early stages of concierge college. So muddled through that day and actually had a really good time doing training films for Gottschalk. And I got to use, at the time I was out here, it's a gentleman named Don DeWolf who went on to a really great radio career down in San Diego and was big time down there. And Don did a ton of voices, so I grabbed him and my training puppet with a G on it. It was not good stuff, but it was stuff. And at the end of that, they offered me a job. So when I graduated, I got to slide right in a job without ever interviewing for a job. And I thought, well, what could be better than that? Of course, it was more pay, but I was just happy to have a gig. And Gottschalk's was what a great start for a kid in his 20s just out of college.
I can absolutely see Phil Lane saying, no problem, I will do this, because he just is the type of person that...
Yeah, and he lived a couple doors down, so if he said no, I would have, stalked him.
Right?
Early 70s stalk mode on him to make sure that happened. But Gottschalk's was a lot like working for the DA, right? So you had a lot of cases. You wish you could spend more time with them, but you really had a lot of volume that ran through that. And, worked with some great folks there. there, and I think the biggest takeaway for me was here's as big of a corporate arena as you would find in Fresno at the time. There's at the corporate office 300 people in that downtown building. So I learned a lot about way to get people to work with you and for you. And if you needed things, how to get chips in your pocket so you could pay them later. All that stuff that I utilized throughout my entire career. Really, it was like my own very version of First Five, except it's first 5 years in a job instead of first 5 years in your life. So that, but the toughest part back in those days was if you want to do something creative, there was a whole line of protocol you would have to go through. People were not handing you gear and going out and saying, direct a spot for you. So it was almost like born out of craftsmanship type trades where you had to start at the lowest level, much like I got my gig in radio. It's like you have to just somebody at some point get sick maybe, and that would make life easier for you. So there my initial stages were, I'm just helping get all the pre-production stuff done. Gottschalk's worked with an agency. Originally it was Cliff Ferguson, and then Al Case. And so I was really just the liaison between that. Jack Moody, who headed up the print side, I wasn't really a part of that. I sat in the mezzanine apart from all of them in this isolated little office that was a catwalk over the shoe department. And next to me was the corporate conference room, and next to that was Joe Levy and Jerry Blum's office. So they always were walking by my desk, and truth is, Joe Levy was probably as much my boss as Jack, because he had such hands-on on the broadcast. And I was hired, and it was a great fancy title as the broadcast coordinator. So I thought I should have been director, truthfully, right out of school, but, probably pay issues or what have you. So got to do that. And in that, as I was pre-production, I would get to hang out at the studios at the time. We were working out of KC and KFSN. So everything was shot either in those studios or on 16 millimeter, because I can remember walking into KC the very first time I walked in out of school, and it was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. It was just the smell of chemicals and film being processed, because that's how they ran newscasts. It seems archaic now to really think like that. That's the way they would present the news, but it was. So we even shot on 16 millimeter back then as well, but it gave me all the tools that I would need to do something else. And I think, I loved my time at Gottschalk's. Tended to be cyclical. January, there was a January sale, well named. In the summer, a summer sale, also aptly named. And then there's this thing called Christmas, and that cycled through just continuing. So after about 6 or 7 of those, I thought, I should probably take what I've learned here and do something, progress with it. So I did end up deciding to go for money. So as I left Gottschalk's, I was going to go work in sales, because I saw what this Southern Belle, Jan Edwards, was doing, just raking in the cash. So I thought, I should be doing that, because there's more money actually in sales than creating stuff. And at age 30, I thought I should be making money. So at that time, I took a job at KMPH. So as I was leaving Gottschalk's, I remember getting my employee discount and buying a warehouse full of suits for my new gig. And somewhere in between, I got waylaid by John Oslin into going to work at his agency. And I'd talked to John before when I was at Gottschalk's. I think that last year when I was starting to get a little antsy, I talked to John. I was over at Thielen, some other folks. And at the time, John had made me an offer, but he was going to pay me the same amount of money. This is going to be hard to believe about John. The same amount of money as I was making at Gottschalk's. So I was trying to explain to him, if you hire me, you should actually pay me more money. It's enticement. It's sort of this thing called capitalism. I don't know if you're aware of it. Maybe you could look it up. So I walked on the deal at that time. But I remember being home in that 2-week period in between, and my roommate was a bartender. I will tell you, it was early in the day. It was maybe like 11 a.m. in that 2-week stretch. I might not have been able to pass either a alcohol or drug test at that moment. The doorbell rings, and they want to have me go talk to John at the agency that night. And I'm thinking, okay, sure. So sort of curtailed what I was doing for that day's plans on the itinerary. I went and talked to John, and he painted this picture that said, hey, I was 4 people, I'm 2 people. I'm going to get infuse of cash from the bank, and I'm getting after it. Are you in now? And he told that to 3 of us in a room. 2 folks were sales folks from different TV stations, and me. And then he brought us in singularly and made us the job offer. And 2 of the 3 of us took it, but I was the only one that made it past a year. John Meisner, who had a great career here in sales and later was a GM at a very high level in Arizona, took the job, but he decided the agency life was too tough at the end of a year. and went back to sales. So that's sort of how I ended up in the agency world. When I took the job with John, it was bifurcated because there was 4 of us. So I bought all the media because I'd done that, and Joe Levy was a great teacher in that arena on how to negotiate. And then I got to play in on production, which was my real love. So as we grew the agency, I was able to jettison the thing I didn't like as much and then move from production director to creative director at JSA. And so that was about happened in the mid-'80s. And it was great because I finally got to really do things I wanted to do. So that was what I would consider the real start of what I really enjoyed.
And before we get to how your path progressed at the agency, I just thought of an interesting question. You've obviously always been involved in, at least in some degree, in the creative process and the creative component of this industry. Do you think that there is something about being a musician that helps with that? And is there some sort of a correlation, do you think, between being able to perform and create music and create art and spots and video?
Yeah, because I think music is just a different artistic, but it all comes from the same portion of the brain, the right portion of the brain, right? And a lot of times you're just creating as you go, or if you're writing, that's just a gear that you have. I remember when I told you didn't have access to things. Like when I was out at Fresno State, the color cameras were over in the corner and only the top people got to use them. So in the undergrad program, you didn't touch those. You had rack lenses, which I always thought, are they using these in the stations? So even I wanted to do a documentary on vintage days at the time. And I was able to check out a camera, but didn't have any editing equipment, so I borrowed my stuff from Gottschalk's, right? Sorry, Joe. And put together a video, right? And that helped me as I moved along. At least I had this little piece of evidence that I could do something. Same way when I was at Gottschalk's doing all the pre-production, when Al Case took a vacation, I already had set up, because I was buddies with the guy that shot at Casey at the time. I said, man, as soon as we get a chance, I've got this idea. And Gottschalk sort of let me run with a concept that was Bobby West. It was for young women, like 1834 demo. And they thought, here's Bruce, so we'll let him do that because he's young and maybe he understands and we're older. So I got to start doing all the radio for Bobby West. And so that was sort of my first, where I started jonesing for it, because it was fun to sit in a room and create copy with somebody. And we had my first taste of a campaign that got notoriety was this Mr. Rogers campaign that I did for Bobby West, and I probably did it much longer than I should, but you don't know back in the day. But I would write it, and then whoever I was would do the voices with me, whether it was DeWolf or a few of my buddies. We'd go into a room and sort of write it together and then go to Marv Allen's studio and produce it. And so it was the first time I got an Addy Golden Oak back at the time. And I can tell you, I'm glad that the group got back together for creatives, especially that early affirmation, even if it's not deserved, right? It's just really important because it goes, hey, I can do this. I've got something in my hands. Maybe I can take it to the next step and actually monetize it. So after the radio deal, Al Case goes on vacation. Now my video buddy is available to me. So I had these concepts for Bobby West, and one of them was a music concept. So went in the studio with Marv, cut this little blues tune, got 6 buddies of mine to go out. We lip synced this song out somewhere as if we were hobos. Bobby West is out by the railroad tracks, got a couple models, and it won an Addy. So now I've got radio and video, so now I'm thinking it's time to do it. And as I say it out loud, I remember being at the Ad Awards, and I had sent it in, and then I saw Al Case there, and I'm thinking, oh man, now I sort of have to come clean that I entered it, and I got all word, and he was all cool about it. So it ended up being fine. But I thought, because it was a nefarious act. I plotted in my living room in my house in order to make this happen. But it's sort of the way that things had to happen to progress back in the day. You had to be in the right place at the right time, and you needed a break. I'm jealous of people coming out of school now because, social media, iPhones, they give you everything at the tip of your fingers. And if you are creative and you can't make it, shame on you, right? At least probably what it does is puts people on a correct pathway a lot sooner in life, right? Because, back in my days, if I had a camera, if I could show them, right? And you worked 12 years to get, to get to that point, well, you'd be very disappointed if you sucked. I think that would be, quite frankly, bad. But fortunately, I made it through all that, and eventually John saw promise. And I think the buying media, I could always do the left brain stuff, but I found, because math was always really great for me, which there is a correlation, math and musicians, right? That's always a deal. So I thought if I could sit there and do that, I would be much more happy throwing away the left brain stuff and ultimately doing the right brain. And it was able to come to fruition. But go figure, at the end of my career, I was back over more on the left brain than I was the right brain. So it all, marketing is both sides. Even if you're doing mostly left brain stuff, you have to play it on both sides in order to make it work. You have to relate to people at a very high level. And if you're creating content, you got to be weird to get sort of, recognized. You have to not be normal. Mm-hmm. You have to be just the 180 of normal. So that was just a perfect fit for me.
I love it. Somebody was sharing with me the other day that fabulous is just this side of crazy. I thought, I'm going to use that. And here I am using it because it's true, right?
Certifiable. Yes. You have to want
just
people
this
not to.
Side of crazy.
They don't want to think, that guy could be my stockbroker and my content creator. That's probably not, you want two different skill sets within that drill. But both of them, you need a little bit of, both.
Mm-hmm. Without a doubt. So you started with John Ostlund, and then you
got her vamping now as I'm going for my water.
I know. If you could see, right, we're doing the stretch, right? So we started with John Ostlund, and that was a path that led to a long and fruitful career with different iterations. So can you kind of walk us through from starting with his shop and how it evolved, and then you and Wendy took over?
Yeah. So John was such a great mentor for me because he was my age and 20 years older, right? Just because he had gotten in that food chain of having to be in survival mode. And so the 15 years as his creative director, really watching him work the business side of it was such a great schooling for me. And John was really good at protecting creatives, which is necessary because you can't bring pressure and all the things that the business side brings into the creative side because it really is counterproductive and really counterintuitive to everything that is good. So I learned that from him as well. And so once I got into the creative director role, it was just sort of like building a team. And again, environments are different. I probably had the same designers with me for a decade, right? People didn't move around as much, so it really created a familial bond almost that still exists. I don't want to, be that cranky old dude telling you to get off my lawn and everything's gone to hell in a handbasket. But it was a little easier to create, and you didn't even have to try that hard, right? You just sort of had fun, and that naturally would just occur within that petri dish. So leading that team was just fun. And I remember probably a pivotal moment was as you get clients and allow what they do, right? If you're in creative, it's like, I'm going to walk a mile in your shoes. And once you get on the agency side, how much you pay me? Okay, I can only walk 250 feet in your shoes, but I'll walk 3 miles in that shoe. So you always had ways to do it. But early on, like radio was theater of the mind, budgets never held, I never felt like a budget kept your creative diminished. You could always work with the tools you had. But having said that, I remember the first Cellular One commercial we got to do, and it was going to be 2 spots, and we had about a $50,000 budget. And I'm like, wow. Because we're used to working in a smaller constraint. And at that time, as is now, there are brilliant people in the marketplace. So there was Grant Spots, had a production company that was born out of KMPH. And so went to Grant, and, you just get to work with the best of the best in that when you have that kind of budget. And so I remember doing those commercials, and it was such an epiphany in terms of, here's what you can do, here's what's capable, here's what, there's a much higher ceiling than I once probably earlier had anticipated. So that was great to happen early on. Ad Club, I remember another like a epiphany in that John Ostlund era. They came to me, and there was a gentleman who did radio spots, and he was well known. His name is escaping me now. And like for back then, if you engaged him, he wrote them, he did it all, and it was like $4,000. So it was a very high level because radio spots were like $1,000 radio spot was a very big deal. So Dick Orkin's Radio Ranch. And so he was going to come to Ad Club, and he was going to be the MC. So I forget whoever was at the Ad Club at the time, they came over and said, hey, will you write his intro? Because he won't know Fresno stuff, right? So basically doing Fresno shtick for his first 5 minutes. So I wrote it, and I looked at it, and I thought, that's pretty like everything you do. It's pretty good, I think I killed it, right? I think I rocked it. So I remember sitting in the audience and then having him read that on stage, and it slayed. But I realized at the time, it wasn't that good. I mean, it was good, but I'd written good stuff like that crapped out. So the way it was delivered with a guy who had this just big time, big market sense of timing and comedic timing made such a big difference with the words that I had written. The lights come on, that's what you sort of have to achieve regardless of the talent you hire. And there's nothing worse when you get in an audio situation, and when we had the ability to not do it at a studio here, and now the world is your talent base, another game changer back in that era. So I would sit at my office on the phone. I learned after somebody read first time, you could move them maybe 20% like if they really didn't have it, you could waste 45 minutes trying to get them to a certain point. Never going to happen. So I ended up just having a safe word with an engineer so that we'd just pay a session rate, and I would stop out after about 10 minutes, try, and God, you nailed it, and then move on to something else. But opening up the ISDN lines with, announcers in their skivvies, in their closets at home, it really opened up, again, another world that we could do. Because in Fresno, the goal was always, to achieve a regional, national feel, but your budgets were always limited. So you were always trying to figure out how to do that. And that really hasn't changed much, I think, throughout the time. The unfortunate part is radio's less of a creative. People don't use it the same way it was before because digital has sort of changed the world, When I started as a creative director in the 80s, you're going to do a campaign. I'm going to do a radio spot, I'm going to do a TV spot, I'm going to do a print ad. And, if I've really got a ton of money, I'm going to maybe direct mail with a campaign or some other small peripheral posters, outdoor, whatever it was. But it was the big three. And now radio becomes much more of a retail informative deal. But before, I think there's just not as much theater of the mind that rolls in radio than it used to. And that was a place where you could always shine because big budgets didn't matter as much. It was really about the words themselves, and you didn't need much to get up to a national level. TV always was, that's a cheap-ass video cam. Right? That always was going to be that. I don't care how you filter it through. But that continued to move, and, DSLRs came on. So all that technology continued to move. But always at the heart of it is, how do I take a Fresno budget that is a local budget and make it look regional and or national? And that was always a fun challenge, and I think continues to be more than solvable. And, in this day, that's something that really hasn't changed in my time.
So when you started with John, was it Jeffrey Scott yet, or was it still Fresno Advertising Associates?
He was just going through the
going through the name change?
Yeah.
Okay.
And, that was all, I don't know if you've talked about that. That was just because of that whole Fresno identity, right?
Right.
Like the time, you don't know much, but you know that if Fresno is not thought of highly outside of our community, definitely not back then. So that would be an impediment, and who wants to have an impediment in their name? And then the other one is just geography. If you were in Fresno and they were in a larger market, that having to bridge that gap wasn't as easy back then. So we didn't know much, but probably not having it be called that. And it was also a lesson in how you name yourself, right? So in the 40 years since, I've gone through a lot of branding, either start from scratch, rebrands, what have you. And I always learned that you tell folks, like, really, the name should be something you like, that really floats your boat, and it can't have the word Hitler or Nazi in it, right? Other than that, I don't know that it's bad, and take all that effort and energy and put it into what attributes you're going to attach to that name, right? But the thing is always, people really want to focus on the name itself. But, Jeffrey Scott was his two nephews, for God's sakes. And then we truncated it to JSA because that's what all the cool kids did. So I always like to use that story with clients. It's like, that's great. You love that name. Let's do it because I think it's going to test out well because it doesn't say Hitler and or Nazi. And we'll really start to spend our time on how we look, how we brand it, how we, create attributes and create that mantra for your brand. So all those life stories as it goes through always is things that help. And that is something that's now a lost art. The people that were at the top of the game just had a ton of tools in their toolbox, and those tools were born out of experience. I did this, it did that, and that was why I don't want to do it or why I do want to do it. This works, that doesn't. And you couldn't argue that because you were 20, like, all right, I guess so. Now we're backed up by so much data. The focus groups are telling you, Bob, that's not the fact, right? But back then, the people who rose were just because they'd been in the game longer than anybody else. So that's why I think that natural caste system happened, pay your dues, Bob got sick, then you get to do something. So, pretty natural.
So before we transition to when you started running the shop at JSA, you mentioned the cellular commercial, which was a lot of fun. But tell us about something that you're particularly proud of from the beginning of your career, an early win, per se.
Yeah. Well, it's a ton of stuff. And by today's standards, really seems weird. But showing up, right? John, and you know him, was a stickler. So his deal was, here's what we're going to do. But like to be a pioneer, we're going to work 7:30 to 5, and then we're going to take Friday afternoons off. But 7:30 isn't 7:31, it's not 7:32. And so we would have a little team meeting at 7:30, so that it would be very evident if you weren't there. And I can remember John Meisner, the guy that hired, who then left after a year. I can remember just being parallel with him on Palm, and we're racing in the clocks there. And John, he had a Volvo, and in his glove box, he could pull out a little microphone, had a speaker, and make a cop sound with that. as we would be blazing through, because we knew it would be problematic. So it taught me at an early age, sort of just showing up matters, right? That's a good thing. But of significance within that was really more, to me, I think, winning that first Addy for that $50,000 spot, because really that was just at such a high level. It was shot on 35 millimeter. It was a union announcer out of LA. So I think in that John time, the two things creatively are just weird things, right? Is that the ceiling getting raised because of an experience. And then it was that Orkin Radio Ranch guy coming to the stage and reading my words in a way that nobody else ever read them. And so it's just those moments along the way that, that you're there. But yeah, I think there's not a lot of single moments that happen for me because there's just a ton of weird events that would go on, and technology would play into it. For example, we did Community Hospital's 100-year celebration at the Warners, right? So we created that from bands of each era played before this deal. We had small little videos. It was really this really elaborate thing. As any large hospital like that, they went through iterations, and the things that would be historical just diminished into a closet at some point, right? So we did a ton of research. It was a great thing to be a part of. It was also just the start of non-destructive editing, so the computers and hard drives and all that kind of stuff. And I remember the night before the show, because it's the same thing, clients giving you re-edits, we're doing that stuff, finally get it pristine, and now it has to be laid back so that we could play it at the Warners. I get a call, it's like 3 p.m, and the production house like, dude, it's just not doing it. It's slow. I don't know what the problem. It was a glitch, blah, blah, blah. It's a hard drive, blah, blah. It's a bunch of stuff, and you're like, oh. So I remember sitting down with the VP of marketing at Community and saying, all right, we're going to start here because we got about 3 hours. And again, in a learning moment, this VP taught me, like, all right, he didn't yell. I was expecting, like, this is not going to be good. He just processes it, says, okay, let's talk about everything that happens if it doesn't work, right? And so we're just doing all the crisis management down the pipeline to here's what we're going to do. And it was such a relief, right? That you had a plan and that you weren't going to just run around the building with your hair on fire screaming, the building's on fire. And ultimately, I called the guy and just said, bring all your equipment. Just bring the whole thing. We'll play it off the hard drive. The risk is it could, as anything, it could glitch or whatever, but it worked out fine through an immense amount of prayer and and luck and voodoo and whatever else was necessary. But my takeaway out of that was not that my blood pressure spiked to 210. It was, in a time of crisis, this gentleman, well-earned VP title, taught me that you walk through all the probabilities and make sure that you have a plan B, C, and D. So that, again, across the board, that's what being creative director in John's shop allowed me. And then after those 15 years, John got the last radio license in Fresno, which was an interesting thing to watch, is that group, 15 people applied and it gets down to 1, and John was at the end, that one. So watching that process was interesting. But at that point, he became less interested in the agency because John's a slacker and agency works hard. No, he loved radio. And so at that point, I went into the executive VP mode, corner office, and I thought, this is going to be great. I'll appoint a CD and then I'll get to still keep my hands in on that. But then I had to sort of switch mode into more of a business acquisition. And the truth is, as a creative director, it does allow that, because new business pitches, creative directors are the integral part. They're the face there, they're up there, they're the ones that are talking to the potential clients along with a couple of other folks. But in many cases, that creative could be the difference between getting an account, not getting an account. So it's like general managers at TV stations. You can get there different ways. You can come out of sales, you can come out of news. Rarely do you come out of CFO, but now that happens on occasion, right? But same thing for when you get to the corner. You can either be creative or you're on the business side. So I think JSA, when I hit the corner office, John had already had a really strong commitment towards the creative product, but you always have to try to set yourself apart. What are your unique selling props? And so I think early on, we always tried to have creative at the forefront, not to the exclusion of the other stuff, data research, strategy, but knowing that always that gulf between here is all the data you need. Here is your target. Here's your person. I have painted that person. There it is. Make them smile, make them buy, make it resonate, right? So I worked with a lot of great people throughout here. Jim Lowe, I remember when he came into the shop, it was about the same time I was just transitioning into the executive director slot. And again, everybody, you want to be not the smartest person in the room because you're going to learn continually. So Jim was so data-driven, in my world up to that point had been entertainment, while still keeping the eye on the prize, but my main focus had to be, if you didn't grab someone's attention, I don't care what you know. I don't care what you're trying to tell them. And so with Jim, we would now, that's getting so much more defined in terms of message, in terms of brand. But I used to always tease him because you still get up to that huge cliff. I don't care how much data you have. When you create that piece of creative that's going to bridge the gap, there still is that bit of a leap of faith that would make datatitions like him go crazy because it is gray and their world's black and white. But it's still great knowledge to have. It's a much better launching point when you have to create something that is a marketing message. So I loved it. But for me, that best part about the career in general are the people and those little events that were marketed, that created a difference. You were different the day after that event. And it didn't have to be necessarily a hair on fire type of event. A lot of them were just epiphanies that you would have because you got to sit at a table and create things with smart people. So again, John used to have a phrase, I don't know if it was Ogilvy or I can't remember which master of marketing it was, but you know that generally all your assets at an agency would go up and down the elevator every night. So when people, oh no, PageMaker means you can create ads without going through a litho process with Vahe, right? You still say it's still who's producing the stuff, who's behind the computer. That matters so much more. And today, even more so, I think, if anything, right? Social media has created a platform where the entry level is very low, and that is great, 100% great, because I'm on TikTok watching all levels of it, and I'm still amused. But the fact is that you have to sort of hone that skill. And at the end of the day, it's the guy or the gal with an iPhone. It's the gray matter of that person creating that's going to be that point of differentiation. And at an agency, it's just as prominent now as when I started. That still has not changed, even though the tools greatly changed. The appetite for that greatly changed amongst folks.
And I am so grateful that you dropped a PageMaker reference, because for listeners, for those of you who are not Bruce and I and have no idea what we're talking about with PageMaker, was a very early publication design platform, and the similar platforms now, of course, would be Adobe, Creative Cloud, Canva, and all
Adobe
those
ended up,
stuff. Adobe ended up crushing PageMaker.
But at the time, PageMaker was not the software of choice. We were sort of outlined, but as a creative director, I was thinking, all right, I think Adobe's going to win this battle at some point. And they did, and bought everybody up around it. But, computers, it's really weird to think that I'm that old. But same thing as happenstance. So when I was in junior at Bullard, I took a typing class because I liked the female to male ratio in a typing class. And I was 16, for God's sakes. But I learned how to type pretty well, and that served me really. Now all of a sudden, I looked at some of my contemporaries who did peck at the keyboard, and it took them longer to gravitate towards that. My very first computer was this Magnavox. I bought it like Home Goods, I think, and it had an amber screen, but I had the ability to write copy, to backspace across that, change words, and then when I was happy with it, I would hit print, and it was a built-in printer. And another one of the folks that I was lucky to work around, Rob Taylor, was working for me at the time part-time. He came in and he saw that thing the first day and he said, get rid of that thing. What are you doing? Right? And so we made the move to a Macintosh with the black screen. And
the Mac Classic, I'm assuming, was probably the first one? I don't know.
All in one. There was several, Classic 2. We actually had the first version. My sister worked for an aviation company, and they did a publication, and then when they went out of business, we ended up buying some of that stuff, and we only used it to set type in the beginning, right? To send it off to Vahe. So even as you start to absorb technology, our thing was we were always like, we'll be the 10th person to do it, not the 100th, but not the first. So we always let it just slightly lag to make sure that it wouldn't kill us. We wouldn't die from it, and then we would adopt in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah, because you have to make sure it's going to stick a little bit, right? Because there's certainly benefits to being an early adopter, but I love that the 10th person, not the 100th, is a solid strategy.
Yeah, but now I will download the beta iOS on my iPhone. Devil be damned, I don't care. Let's go for it. Let's get risky.
So let's talk about clients and client mix, because obviously the clients that you started with are probably different than the clients that the agency has now.
Yeah.
Or maybe not. But if you could kind of talk about how that has gone over the years, whether it's different industries, have you had different strategies as far as client mix? How has that gone?
Yeah, I think definitely has changed, right? I would say back in when I started, TV sort of was just starting to rule the day. That's how I got my gig at Gottschalk's, right? They just were starting to get into television. When I started at Gottschalk's, they had 3 people still sketching dresses and microwaves and stuff for the newspaper. They had 3 artists, wonderful people who had to see the end coming, but Jolie was one of the last ones to really take photography and put it into his ass. Now it looks wonderful when you look back, right? And these guys were awesome illustrators, but not going to happen all the way through. So what's the question again?
The question was about client mix and how things have changed or not.
With TV being the prominent medium, there were just a lot of people who couldn't do it and wanted to do it right. And so a local shingle would be pretty easy to grab. As time progressed, consolidation happened. Take a company like we had Cellular One. We were in the market, 2 cellular carriers come in. They gave one to AT&T, and the second one had to be somebody who wasn't in the telecommunications game. That was just the way the rules were set up. So that was Cellular One. So when Cellular One came into the market, we ended up getting them. We worked with them, grew the business to multiple markets. It was a wonderful, wonderful company with a lot of smart people. Then they got bought out by AT&T. It got brought up under their umbrella. People left that company. It's just what sort of the natural rhythm of things. And then they no longer had somebody local handling their business. It happens with auto groups. When I started, Datsun dealers, which then became the Nissan Datsun dealers, which then became the Nissan dealers, that would have been handled here. Now it's at a tier out of the market and only local dealerships. So I think in general, as before digital, the universe shrunk a little bit. So you had to work the larger clients in a different manner. Then you would have new categories come in all the time. So let's say gaming came in, was great for agencies in the beginning because those were large, meaty accounts. And we were fortunate to have some of that in our agency. And they were data rich because of all the information on the gamers and what have you. And it was great. But then they are so big that now the industry trend for them is to go in-house and to piecemeal out things that they do. Maybe they'll piecemeal out creative. We've worked in that model with a casino. But generally, most of the media purchasing that stuff. So those hardy budgets, I can remember, ultimately sitting in the corner office owning an agency thinking, I liked it a lot better when Cliff Ferguson and Al Case and those guys owned agencies, because they were getting that media chunk that was 15% and nobody asked them any questions. And, as we've migrated now, people might want to talk about how we're compensated and take a deeper dive into that. And then when digital hit, more so. And so if I looked at the way an agency made money from when I started with John, media commissions, production, and then hour compensation, now the hourly compensation has grown so much greater because of content that you create and just things that media commissions have necessarily dipped, because now you're working a lot of times with smaller budgets, because in the digital world you can. All good stuff, all doable, but nothing ever stays static. Definitely. And as I'm sitting here and we're talking about this today, right, 5 years from now, it'll be a different way to make it. But always a focus for us through that client thing was to take clients that had strong creative need, try to make sure that we were scratching that. So if we had a foot forward, it was always the creative foot, because at the end of the day, that having a product that resonates, having a message that resonates, having something that people acted upon was still magic, and still is today. So even though the tools make it a little bit more difficult, the digital world is very small in geography print, but you have stories, you have video, and it's, what's good is bad, always. So, but the client base has changed, and I think I would say for the good. Hopefully Fresno will have, I think there'll be a spurt born out of digital, right? Because you can only, in that hourly mode, the large shops have to have this funding that is going to be from really big clients. And as that gets smaller, you're going to have a lot. And I don't want to call them boutique because it almost sounds dismissive, and it's not. Boutiques are wonderful. You'll have a lot of these genesis, I think, of folks who are working in social PR and non-adjacent to just straight up marketing world. And those shops that start will naturally grow. It's the way it happens. They'll have a client, the client loves them, your interface is perfect, I love this relationship, hey, can you also? And so they'll figure out how to scratch that itch, and then they'll get into branding, because all that stuff is so tethered together for a client. And all that stuff sort of, contracts, expands as it's like an amoeba from college. But I can remember where IATs were big. So you're sitting around these integrated marketing groups, and you might break out Spanish or ethnicity away from it and give that to somebody, and then you're going to have somebody who's over here on social and they're doing that, and you might even have a different digital product and PR, and that was a thing, and you could do that because now Zoom and all that. But I think, and there's a form of that still, I think, fairly prevalent, but it's contracting again because it's hard to cradle the brand with a lot of people touching it. So at the end of the day, always somebody has to be that brand monitor, regardless of what the activities are. And I think the agency role in that will stay pretty prominent. I think what agencies just always, you have to jettison it. Like, you can't become proprietary. Like, all right, you're going to divvy that up? All right, no problem. Keep the eye on the prize, that branding, how the public perceives you, those 3 or 4 attributes they apply to your name, to your product, to your service, heavily important.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Without a doubt.
Yeah, so I think people who continue to embrace that will always do well.
Mm-hmm.
But I think there'll be more people in the profession, you know. When I came in, it was by design to limit it to a few, right? Like, you got to just stand in line. It's like being at Disneyland a little bit, and then you got to figure out how you can buy that skip the line ticket where possible, right? And try to just create scenarios that put you in a position. I don't think that's as prevalent today because, you know, if I was just entering it, I would have personally bought some stuff for my iPhone to give it more cinematographic value so that I could, you know, at the end I would just be taking concepts I had up here and putting them out for publication. And it's just easier to do now, so I'm jealous. And I'll say that out loud, I'm jealous.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there is definitely something to be jealous of. And one of the most interesting things, right, about doing these reflection type conversations is to see, you know, what new opportunities that exist now that didn't before, and how the core of what makes people successful in this space are still the same.
Yeah. Everything old is new again. Mm-hmm. So born out of relationships, if you can have a conversation, have somebody respect you, like you, all those things that are just important. I think more important in today's environment, you know. I guess if I ever am going to feel something that makes me feel old and yell at kids to get off my lawn, if I progress to that, is that I do think we're not as kind as a society in general, right? And so there is a little level of meanness that wasn't there before. And sometimes you use it to advantage. You know, if you're working a platform for a client on Twitter, now X, and it's conversational, you could be a little cheeky, right? And I think it's reflective of that, and there's not anything wrong. And it's always been a portion of the Don Rickles-esque humor. Always been there, but I think it's just a little bit greater and prevails at a higher level. The other thing that makes me glad I'm sort of getting out of the game is that brands now being held to that in a political realm, maybe a political filter. And so cancel culture and what has become much more commonplace now, you know, really makes me, would add another filter as I create now, right? So you're going to have to take that filter and put it on there. You still might do it, but at least from a strategy standpoint, you're planning on doing it. And I want to be, you know, and there are niches where you can, but if you're global, it's making it a lot more difficult. And Budweiser and Disney and, you know, the world is, there's a litter behind a wake from that. And I don't know, maybe we'll get a little bit of a pendulum swing back to something a little bit more normal, because at the end of the day, it's mostly words and it's entertainment. And I've always, just in general in the world, right? Did you intend to hurt me? That's different than I inadvertently did something. And so you have to give leeway for the inadvertent, and the intentional, I'm down, 100% down with saying, okay, then that's not good. But, you know, we're having that. And I think for marketers to sort of figure that out, also, I think you learn that if you're important to 33% of the people, if you can really make a certain segment, and it doesn't have to be 51%, doesn't have to be 70%. So now marketers are having to make a decision on, if I really resonate and energize 30% of the people to buy my product, is that better than being wishy-washy with 60% of the folks, right? So old school thought was, don't ever diminish your universe. I think as brands get out there and start thinking about that now, it's going to be a little bit different. And different by category. Hospitals aren't going to really be out there. They have their own set of problems that are unique to their industry. But I don't think getting cancel culture will be one issue for them. But it will be for, you know, apparel. And it's just the way that folks think now as they make purchases. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that has to be brought into the equation. There's always more stuff going in the equation, not less.
This is true. I think that is definitely a fact. So more math.
I like math.
To circle it back to the beginning. So as we wrap up today, let's talk to someone who is interested in embarking in a career in this space. What advice would you give them?
That's funny because I still like talking to folks who are starting out, oddly enough. So Monday, kid comes in, who graduated, been doing some stuff, and is just looking for a way in. And I'm always happy to have that conversation because I think our industry has been one that has been not as inclusive as it could be. I think it's much more so now, probably born out of more the way business was done earlier on, and just by that same caste system that we talked about. Now it's easier, but I always have felt, even at the early stages, making all boats rise for marketing is a better deal than, so I always had a problem with the salesperson who was selling something, and then they would walk in and that product's bad, and you don't have to sell against anybody. But that used to be more prevalent, and I think it's diminished, thankfully. So I like having more folks join our legions because there's more need. And Fresno really could be a bigger place, especially now walls have come down with Zoom and what have you. Back to the growth of agencies, client base also by geography has changed in that we're able to handle an account who is based in Sacramento, who is based in San Francisco in a much different way than we used to because of the power of Zoom and the way that it makes me look younger with certain filters, just saying. So for anybody that's in my office and I'm chatting, it's still about that, the passion. So I'm always like, what floats your boat? What makes you smile? What do you want? Do you not know? Are there multiple things? Because a lot of folks will come in and they'll be right brain, left brain. They'll like both sides of it. And so I try to give them a little bit of a picture. Like for me, I think digital is a world that is going to be exponentially blown up. So if I was starting out my career right now, even knowing that I want to make full-length movies, whatever the drill is, I want to write the greatest story ever told. Even you have that creative bent, work the left side of the brain, because there's multi-tool players are really, a crescent wrench is really, really good right now in marketing. When I started, it was all, you're calling out your specific tool, right? And that was just a silo that you existed in. And now, if I'm sort of figuring out who I'm talking to in digital, set those parameters, monitor those, and then I'm doing creative against that. And now I actually test my creative in that environment, and I'm able to do more of what people are telling me they like and less of what people are not. I would want to learn from that. That's where I'd use my starting point today if I came out, just because I think that would be my entree. That would be analogous to me starting at Gottschalk's and just sitting and letting Joe Levy walk by and having a small conversation with him and then going in and look at what the print department's doing, right? It would allow me to understand marketing at a really good level of both sides. And then it would allow me to sort of figure out which route I would end up ultimately taking or what floats my boat. Because maybe over here, getting those audiences and doing that science, and while math is necessary and on the right side, maybe it really drives me much more than the other side of the brain. So I like that ambiguity that digital offers, and people are buying that. I would do that, and you could have 4 small clients that would give you, even in our inflationary times, enough money to get an apartment and exist and figure life out. So I have a pretty strong feeling that's what I would do, and I would grab my iPhone, and because I think moving to the corner office taught me that. I enjoyed all those aspects, and everything old is new again. I sort of got to come back to that at the end of my career. I got to still play in on the creative product. I still got to work the branding, messaging, and the fun stuff. But ultimately, it's still the ones and zeros. I found solace in working a spreadsheet to see if I could make payroll. I did not find solace if I could not make payroll, but I found solace in that. And it was just fun. It still made me smile. It took me back. I'll leave you with this story. So when I was in Wasco, small town, went to Catholic school. It was only 3 years I spent in Catholic school. Also very formative because it was taught by nuns. And in the 6th, 7th grade, there was one nun, taught 2 classes, and she'd go back and forth. So it helped me with my comedy because I had a lot of spare time when she was teaching the other class. And then when I got to 8th grade, there were a few classes they didn't teach because we were, probably like 26 students in that class. So me and Kathleen Strumpf would get on a bicycle and ride to TJ, Thomas Jefferson, the public school, and we would take biology and algebra because we could. And I remember, again, it's that environment of I don't know anything, so you have to read the room, which teaches you everything you always have to know in life is, don't be stupid on day one, right? Figure out who rules the day, who you need to be friends with, who you don't want to upset, and who are the folks like you. That taught me that then, and that's the way that life always is. So for a student, I'm like, get in there. A job where you could read the room would be the most important thing, because even though you think you know what you want, even at the agency, people would come in on the selling side or the account side and move across and would take a job when one opened, said, I'll do that if I can write copy for 20 hours. And sometimes those were the best gems. So I think digital gives them a whole universe that wasn't there before. And even if they stayed in that universe, there's nothing that ever is going to diminish on that. Niches are going to become more finite, not wider. Mm-hmm. And that's the world. I wish if I could do it over again, I'd be born now just because I think it'll be more interesting ultimately for people who get in the marketing deal.
I agree. I think there's definitely interesting times ahead. So, Bruce, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today. What fun to hear all about your wonderful career. And I did promise a million adventures, and I think we got there. So that was fabulous.
And those were the G-rated, really, mostly. And I tried to keep it clean for, even though it's a podcast and, we could have delved heavier. But yeah, it's been a blast. I wouldn't change any of it, to be honest with you. Even the folks would not change one single thing.
What a beautiful bow for this conversation this afternoon. Thank you very much.
All right. Thanks, Betsy.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Central Valley Stories, Advertising and Public Relations. Join us again next time as we talk history, trends, changes, and challenges with more of the region's veteran practitioners and agency owners. Until then, take care and be well.